So this is the second session of the afternoon. It's devoted to resilience and inequalities. I'm a little bit at a loss to introduce the session as far as resilience in particular is concerned, because the term is quite in broad use at the moment, but there seems to be some disagreement among people I've been talking to about what it means. I've done an evaluation a couple of years ago about the work of FAO in resilience. There was a lot of talk about the sort of meaning of the concept. I suppose that it means, quite classically, the capacity of any system to survive and maintain itself functionally in the face of shocks. So from that very broad definition, to avoid poverty is resilience, to develop is to develop your resilience, and therefore resilience is in everything and vice versa. So I suppose that will do for the introduction of the session. I'm sorry to not go further deep into the relationship between the resilience and inequalities. I think the presentations that are going to be provided to you will, of course, illustrate some of those connections. We are going to start with our colleague here next to me, Vidya Diwakar. She works in ODI in the Chronic Poverty Advisory Network, which was formerly known as the Chronic Poverty Resource Center. And she's been working on trying to follow households in their trajectory in and out of poverty, if you wish, and trying to understand how a set of mainly rural households, as I understand, move away from poverty either permanently or not. So that's going to be Vidya's presentation. Birte, further to my left, Birte Snilstveit, I hope I'm not butchering the name too much, works in 3IE, International Initiative for Impact Evaluation, and she's going to present a piece on how the impact evaluations that she studied, she looked at a sample of them, how they appear to be slightly blind to inequalities, not really looking very much into the issue of inequalities. And finally, Cecilia Poggi from the Agence Française de Développement, IFAD, is going to present on basically their new research projects. IFAD, as I understand, is setting up or beefing up its capacity to analyze and explore poverty and inequality issues, so a sort of poverty lab, if I understood well. And she's going to present a few of those ideas. She told us before the start of this session that she's only 3 weeks with AFD, and she's replacing a colleague who hasn't been able to come. So she's asking for forgiveness, but I think I'm pretty sure it's going to be okay. Don't worry. So without further ado, Vidya, if you're ready, yep. We're in your hands for 10 minutes, therefore, on analyzing poverty dynamics.
Thank you, Olivier. As Olivier mentioned, I work in the Chronic Poverty Advisory Network, which is a network of researchers, practitioners, and policymakers hosted at the Overseas Development Institute in London. I'll be speaking to you today about some of the work we've been doing across a series of countries around analyzing poverty dynamics and the drivers that enable households to both escape poverty but then subsequently remain out of poverty over the long run. So just a bit of background context to this work. In CPAN, we believe that to get to zero extreme poverty, this requires 3 types of action. Action number 1 is to tackle chronic poverty. That is poverty that's often long and persistent, transmitted intergenerationally often from parents to children and so on. Action area 2 is to prevent impoverishment or descent into poverty. And action area number 3 is to ensure that once households have escaped poverty, that they in fact do remain out of poverty over time. However, this research has emerged from the observation that escapes from poverty aren't always sustained. So what this figure shows is the gray bar specifically shows households which, after escaping poverty, subsequently return to living in poverty, whereas the yellow bar shows households which have escaped and have successfully remained out of poverty. What this figure does is then it represents a barrier to ending extreme poverty and a sign that households aren't always resilient. Resilience here being defined as the set of capacities enabling households to both escape poverty and remain out of it over time. So in this study, our objective then is to investigate why some households are able to escape poverty and remain out, while others escape only to fall back in it, that is, their escapes are transitory in nature. And in this presentation specifically, I discuss some of the findings related to inequalities that prevent sustained escapes from poverty. The study is headed by the director of CPAN, Andrew Shepard, but it's based on a team of researchers listed here, but you can read the research report, the synthesis report, or the individual case studies as well for more detail on that. Specifically, this presentation today draws on evidence from Ethiopia, Tanzania, Rwanda, Kenya, as well as I'll also make reference to recent research I've been doing in Nepal and Bangladesh. So I won't go into the details, the nitty-gritty of this slide, but only to say that for this analysis, we've relied on both quantitative regression-based analysis of panel data, that is data that repeatedly surveys the same households over time and thus enables poverty trajectories to be constructed. And then this was complemented by qualitative fieldwork, including key informant interviews, focus group discussions, and life history interviews with poor households on these different poverty trajectories. So just to give a bit of context and background to the different countries, when we compare panel data across these countries, what we see is the following observations. So first of all, it's worth mentioning that the periods on which this survey data comes from is generally, it covers both the financial crisis or immediately after, but in general it's periods of good growth. However, in spite of this, what we see from the green bars is that, for example, in our African countries of analysis, sustained escapes from poverty constitute just between 5 and 12% of the sample, slightly higher in our South Asian countries of interest. Now, what this figure does is that it puts a question mark around the general celebration of reduced poverty. We are not discrediting this by any means. We acknowledge that there has been poverty reduction over the decades. However, what this figure shows is that the fortunes of households do change over time, and that what poverty headcount information shows is more of a snapshot of poverty trends over time, whereas what we get from panel data is more of a dynamic view, like a movie, if you will, so really tracing households over time to get a dynamic view of poverty changes over time. So in the study, we investigate sources of resilience for households, and the sources of resilience we investigate include household characteristics, household activities, including engagement in the non-farm economy, household attributes, including household size and education of the household head, and so on. But once more, the results I present today are based on those which touch on inequalities, which we are here to discuss. So the first finding I will present to you is around gender relationships, which we've heard people in other panels speak about. In our study, in our series of studies, what we've done is disaggregated these relationships into both constraints and enablers to sustaining a poverty escape and building resilience over time. So one such constraint is when you look at gender inequality as manifest through the lens of stigma and discrimination. So from our results, what you see is that female headship generally is associated with a reduced likelihood of an escape from poverty being sustained in the regression-based analysis. Of course, there are exceptions to this, Bangladesh being one, but actually once you disentangle the reasons for female headship is when you do see an interesting finding wherein, for example, female heads which are female-headed in name, where an otherwise male head has migrated and is sending home remittances, are relatively well off and able to sustain an escape over time, whereas those which are divorced, vulnerable, or separated constitute a more vulnerable group. And then in addition, as another constraint, as women accumulate assets in several of these countries, risks also often increase. And in East Africa, these risks include risks often from the fieldwork of theft or of property grabbing by husbands' relatives upon widowhood, divorce, or separation. And even in Nepal, what we've seen from our fieldwork is that there is as well gendered risks embedded in the country, but there are different manifestations of these risks embedded in discrimination. For example, there were several instances of certain castes frowning upon their wives working, so then when there was a descent into poverty of a household, this descent was particularly long-lasting without the combined income to promote an escape from poverty over time. As a second type of constraint, I'll speak briefly about that of intersecting inequalities, which follows on from the intersection of caste and wealth, for example, but also in other instances. For example, as a separate study in Bangladesh, what we've done is we've looked at disability and poverty dynamics, and there we've seen a triple intersection of persistently poor women with disabilities who face outcomes in terms of lower receipt of social transfers, more vulnerable employment, and so on, compared to even their male comparator groups. So now that's a bit of the constraints, but similarly to their enablers in terms of gender relationships. And here we've seen from our studies that sustained escapes are really prevalent where there is some form of collaboration between husband and wife. So collaborative relationships which do take place. And in Rwanda, this was especially the case when there were initially a level of assets or land to capitalize on, and evidenced in South Asia where there was where this was also underpinned by good savings practices. However, in the policy sphere, then what you see is that enhancing marital harmony is not generally a policy issue in countries researched, and moreover, there should be more efforts to equalize property rights, which both works to reduce impoverishment, but then also increases women's economic empowerment and negotiating power, to then reduce asset loss from property grabbing and so on, because assets more generally in our study, when pooled, is seen to increase this ability to sustain escape. And on assets specifically, this turns me to my final point around livelihood strategies. Here what we've seen across country studies is a significance of both farm and non-farm assets. I won't go into detail of these, but to note that in spite of the significance of these very types of assets, and in rural areas, the importance and the instrumental value of accumulating agricultural assets in particular, when faced with the constraint of shrinking resources, households that have been able to sustainably escape poverty have undertaken several strategies, including diversifying crop and livestock within the farm or into a non-farm business, often moving into urban-based activities, even remittances from migrants, which are often also an important ingredient. However, again, then finally moving to the policy sphere, we see that contributions to sustaining an escape from poverty remain primarily in the form of social policies. Getting economic policies to work for the poorest of the poor is much tougher. And of course, while governments may be justifiably focused on FDI, on developing small and medium enterprises, which is more growth from above, which can of course provide opportunities for poor migrants, our research has highlighted that the poorest of the poor largely progress through growth from below, which is a combination of agriculture, of non-farm growth, of migration to towns for work or enterprise development. In other words, policies that reduce these wealth inequalities. Finally, what our research has shown is that while growth from below is difficult to foster, it's a key ingredient in sustaining poverty escapes, in building resilience, and in the road to zero poverty. And I'd like to end on a note by saying that what this research has done is we investigate sources of resilience that can lead to sustained escapes or that may prevent escapes from being sustained. And in doing so, we see various inequalities, both related to demographics such as gender, but also livelihoods and associated policies which prevent resilience and sustained escapes. And ultimately what we see is that, and what should be more prevalent in the development discourse, is that poverty escapes and inequalities are by no way a one-way street, and this dynamic element should be brought to the fore. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vidya. I like the trajectories very much. They're fascinating. I think so much of our lives is made of meeting people, buying something, building on, and losing sometimes. So, yeah, for me the takeaway is that it's not a one-way street. You can go up, you can go down. These things happen. Birte, from 3i, are you ready to present on your samples of impact evaluations?
How do I?
You press on that button. Oh, put on your presentation. That's been put on. Your friends here. Maybe in the beginning you want to speak a little bit about yourself?
Yes, I can do that. So yeah, my name is Birte Snilstveit. I'm a senior evaluation specialist at the 3i London office, where I focus primarily on evidence synthesis and evidence mapping. So I think it's fair. So Olivia kindly defined resilience in very broad terms. So thank you for that, because I think the work that I'll be drawing on today wasn't explicitly about resilience, but it's all related. So a key premise of this conference is that evaluation can play an important role in informing the strategies and interventions that governments implement to reduce rural inequalities. But it's also clear that this is an area that's under-researched with limited evidence. And so when we add climate change to the mix, the picture becomes even bleaker. So I'm sorry to be yet another bearer of bad news. But so really, if there is one key message that I hope that you take away from my presentation, it's that unless we take the challenge of actually measuring the effects of interventions that we implement on inequalities, then there is a high risk that we fail to meet the vision of Agenda 2030. And I guess the reason why I say that is so I'm drawing on some work that we've done to look into the evidence base. And so in 2016, we were funded by the Children's Investment Fund Foundation to map the evidence on land use change and forestry interventions. And they were particularly interested in evidence that looked at both human welfare outcomes, particularly food security, as well as environmental outcomes and particularly greenhouse gas emissions. So we conducted something that we call an evidence gap map. So for those who have not heard of these before, they are thematic collections of evidence on the effects of interventions on a particular thematic area. And so they are mapping the availability of impact evaluations and systematic reviews. And so this is an example of an evidence gap map. So you can see it's structured around the framework of interventions and outcomes. And then we do a systematic search of the literature and categorize the evidence that is out there and kind of slot it into the different cells in the map. There are different colours of the bubbles, and the colours of the bubbles represent different types of studies. So the grey bubbles are impact evaluations, so those are primary studies looking at the effects of interventions. And the coloured bubbles are systematic reviews. And so for the systematic reviews, we use a traffic light system. So the green bubbles are systematic reviews where we have high confidence in their findings based on assessing the quality of the study using a structured checklist. The orange bubbles, we conclude we have medium confidence in the findings, and the red bubbles, we have low confidence in the findings because the reviews are severely flawed in the methodology. And finally, the blue bubbles are ongoing systematic reviews. And so these are available from our website, and you can see, so you hover over a bubble and you get a pop-up where you can then click through to a study. on our database. So the idea is that one of the ways that these can be used is to make existing evidence available. But then also a key function, we typically do these when, for example, so we're primarily a funder of research, so when we fund research in a new area, we do a map first to identify where there are important gaps. So you can see, so the red box here is what we call an absolute gap. So that's an area where there's very little evidence, and so the recommendation would then be that if this is an area of policy interest, then you might consider funding or doing a primary study. And the blue box are what we call synthesis gaps. So those are areas where there are sufficient impact evaluation evidence for a systematic review to potentially add value. And so based on this evidence gap map, we, as you see, the bottom blue box, that is payment for environmental services, and we're actually in the process of finalising a systematic review that was started based on this work. So the focus of this conference is on inequality, and so we have recently, so we've been doing these evidence gap maps for a number of years, and our most recent innovation to how we do them is, so we call them equity sensitive gap maps. So that means that we look at how the studies we identify, how they deal with equity or and inequality. Admittedly, it's a fairly reductionist view of what proper equity analysis is, but I think it nevertheless gives us some idea of what these studies look at. And so for this map, we identified almost 250 studies, and so 4/5, so almost 295 of the studies didn't consider equity at all. So that means that they didn't undertake a subgroup analysis to look at effects at different population groups, which is one way that we kind of would flag a study as looking at equity, or they didn't study an intervention that had as a goal to reduce inequality in some form, or assess the impact of an intervention on a particularly vulnerable group. So for an area of programming where you have things like protected areas, for example, payment for environmental services, where there are changes to the rights or what is allowed in terms of using land, and knowing that a lot of vulnerable groups might depend on that land for their livelihood. I think that's a quite important and serious limitation of the evidence base. And similarly, and I guess related to that, is the fact that there were only, so of these almost 250 studies, only 21 studies looked at effects on both human welfare outcomes and environmental outcomes. So we have studies that look at only environmental outcomes, but not how it affects people, and then we have studies that look at people but not the environment. So that's, obviously that only gives us a small part of the picture. And finally, in terms of quality, so this is an area where, compared to a lot of other areas that we look at, there are serious limitations in terms of qualities. There are very few randomized controlled trials. There's a large number of studies using different types of quasi-experimental approaches, but they are generally sitting on what we would consider the kind of weaker types of design. So, for example, they will not have baseline data. So, finally, So I argue that producing more equity-sensitive intervention research is a cheap insurance against failure to achieve our policy objectives of helping people adapt to climate change and reduce inequality. So there is an urgent need for studies to evaluate interventions in this area, and those studies should look at both socioeconomic outcomes and environmental outcomes, and to address equity in a more comprehensive way. I think the studies that do this at the moment, it's more of a box-ticking exercise, and at best they look at subgroup analysis, but to actually be informed in the design and data collection, the research questions of using a equity perspective. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Birte. And I think presentation in a row, and then we'll ask for comments. So Cecilia Poggi on the plans of the IFAD to study, research inequality.
Thank you very much. Actually, I have to say that now, after listening to the presentation, what I'm going to propose you today kind of follows on the main take-homes that we received from our two presenters. So the plan of my talk actually will be to very quickly introduce you what is the IFAD engagement from the research side on inequality research, and then briefly introduce you to the EU IFAD research facility on inequality, which is an ongoing set of projects. And lastly, try sort of following Vidya's point on the relevance of individuals which in rural areas face uncertainties, and Birte proposing new evidence on the gaps that we have research-wise. I will actually propose you some initial ideas that a colleague of mine, Philippe Roudier, is having for his upcoming project on the strategies, on some strategies which could be useful to improve resilience. And I will present you the project plan for research on climate adaptation policy and inequality in rural Senegal. So first of all, very, very briefly, what do we do at the research department of IFAD? So the IFAD, or French Development Agency, has in its mandate the objective to reduce inequality and poverty. And recently, through to its latest strategic orientation on the reduction of vulnerability, it has also proposed to have a much stronger attention on the role of social cohesion. And forms of inequality tend to be what weakens the most social cohesion in a society. I know that the topic of social cohesion is a very wide umbrella, but we can tell that also different inequality measures can have a direct role in impacting how inclusion of a society and the formation of social capital takes place. So within the IFAD research department, we look at very broadly different sides of inequality analysis, moving from education and health to distributional studies, and we try as much as we can to devote attention on the side of access to services and also the quality of these. And of course, within the research framework that we conduct in our research pieces, we also look at both gender and spatial dimension. And I was asked this morning what actually we were doing in this research department, and I wanted just to clarify that we support on one side the operations of our agency, but also on the other we collaborate with governments and the research institutes in our partner countries, and we produce research output. Talking about which, we are now undergoing a project thanks to the funding of the European Union, which is called the Research Facility on Inequality. And it is a 3-year program with a 4 million grant, which is devoted to finance research projects which look at inequality in those who are called the Development Cooperation Instrument eligible countries by the EU. And its core objective is really to create collaboration in between the policy and the academic world to increase the knowledge gaps that we have about forms of inequality, their drivers, and potential policy solutions. And within this objective, the research facility has two main branches that compose it. The first one is called the Global Research, in which we are now undergoing 6 research projects on a cross-country comparison on the drivers, dynamics, and most successful policy outcomes of various forms of inequality. And then something that I will talk a little bit more into detail today, we also perform country-specific and city-specific research, which currently are in 10 countries and 3 cities. And the very core objective of this research facility is then to try to drive from very various research projects several policy recommendations for the countries where we are going to undertake the research, but also for the development agencies within the EU. So, to have a feeling of where this research is taking place, we move from Mexico to Vietnam, passing through various countries within the African continent. And as you can see on the map, we have also 3 blue dots that represent the 3 cities that have been selected by an academic research group, actually a consortium of researchers, to undertake city-based projects in cities as diverse as La Paz, Johannesburg, and Amman. And within all of this variety of research projects, we focus on different aspects which linked from access to health and education, particularly in countries like Burkina Faso. We are engaged into education analysis from a perspective of access, but also seeking behavior of which type of education do we see happening, and whether there is any inequality in it. And then there is also interest in looking at the local or spatial inequality that is visible within a society, this either from an economic or social perspective. And of course, due our role as a development agency, we also care a lot at what can be good policy instruments that then can tackle such type of inequalities found. And today, I will actually show you some very initial ideas of a research project which looked in the specifics to forms of rural inequality and which inspects what could be potential policy responses with the use of the so-called agroecological intensification. So this project is led by a colleague of mine, Philippe Roudier, and it asks, how can we best design a climate change adaptation policy which is able to reduce inequality and poverty whilst promoting agroecological intensification? And the country of implementation will be Senegal, with a participation of the Ministry of Agriculture and the 2 research centers in the country. And the core objective of this research is to, first of all, look at forms of economic inequality within and between localities. So here for Senegal, we actually have a very small number of research which has been undergone looking at this geographical aspect. And also another important aspect is to look at which instruments can best work. And this project will look at the current situation and also at simulating what could be potential climate adaptation strategies in the future. And here you go. I will skip a few slides due to time issues, but the core and let's say the innovation of this project is that the researchers are interested in looking at what is called agroecology, which is a type of instrument which links together agricultural and livestock system, which proposes different forms of either intercropping or mixed cropping strategies, but that most interesting of all adds a layer of complexity to its implementation because it is locality specific. And today we have been seeing that many panelists have been always stressing the need for looking at how territorial inequalities have a role to play. And basically this research project wants to take from the stock of evidence that we have in the past on climate adaptation strategies. And instead of proposing just one single instrument, it will try to combine multiple together and to look at what could be a best scenario of climate adaptation in the area. And just to quickly skip ahead, it's another innovation, another novelty of this program is that it is an interdisciplinary methodology applied, where the very core idea of the model is to put together a form of bioeconomic model, but also look through participatory approach and what the actual communities that have been looked at, what do they think that could be the main constraints to their activity. And its final objective will be, first of all, to compare different forms of standard intensification strategy with agroecological ones, and also to propose potential ways to have functional intercropping adoption. The outcomes are not yet there. As I said, we are just at the moment at the sign-off and programming stage. And so if you would like to know more about it, my colleague, Philippe Rodier, would be very, very glad to be contacted for more information at the email seen here on the slide. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Cecilia. And thank you all for your patience and for your assistance. We are now moving into the debate or the discussion about the issues that have been presented. I would encourage the audience to be creative in their questions and perhaps also to move beyond the material that has just been presented. I have myself, maybe if I can launch or start with a question. As I said, Vidya, I liked your trajectories. I think it's a very good way to think of our lives, which are far from simple and far from being unidirectional. So I kind of like that. And also I like that because in a previous life I was working in New York for UNDP and looking into the MDGs, the work in support of the MDGs by UNDP. And what struck me really during that work was how sometimes simplistic ideas were held about development and about the MDGs. In particular, the idea that you could reach the MDGs once and for all. Like once you reach them, well, you reach them, right? But in fact, it's, as we are seeing now, for example, with the food insecurity data coming from FAO, you can very well reach them and then the next year not reach them. It's perfectly possible. And in fact, if we believe the previous speaker, we might be in an era of such, if you wish, sliding back. It's always possible to slide back. So I guess my question to Vidya would be, what have you learned in looking at how people move forward and sometimes slide back? I mean, you mentioned a few characteristics of the people who managed to sustainably escape poverty. One was, for example, I like that, the fact that the husband and the wife cooperate around a common project. Any other thing that we can learn from that's research and that can help people like in this room working on development? Any things that can help them identify strength, identify opportunities to help people escape from poverty? That'd be my question to Vidya. And then I have a question to Birte, and then I'll shut up. It's basically your evidence map highlight the fact that a lot of impact assessments or impact evaluations are blind to equity issues. Why do you think that's the case? Is that just because people don't think of it? Is that because in their sort of theory of change or plan for development, they consider inequalities as perhaps not a problem? I'm reminded that, you know, in classic liberal economics, if you wish, economic inequalities are often presented as a strength of a system, as a motivator. You know, the classic argument being that if everybody is receiving the same sort of resources or attention, nobody will work, etc., etc. So, in a Darwinian sense of the words, or in a Darwinian view of the world, inequality is also seen as a strength and or as a motivator for society. And perhaps that's what at the core of this thing are the impact assessment that you looked at. Are they considering inequality as a problem or as a solution, perhaps? Thank you.
Thanks, Olivier. On what other factors could enable a sustained escape from poverty, particularly what's striking in our research is the combinations of activities that are needed for this to happen. So, for example, it's often agriculture with some engagement in the rural non-farm economy or into urbanization, moving into urban areas, whether it's through renting property and so on. Another thing is, this also then brings in the issue of both tangible asset development in terms of land, and if land is and a resource that is available in quantity, or also intangible asset development. So specifically here, with regards to education, our research indicates that it's primarily secondary education, which has been across countries conducive to sustaining an escape from poverty. The results of primary education are more mixed and dependent on quality as well as links to labor market and so on. And relatedly then, in terms of secondary education, so yes, this is both an intrinsic and instrumental benefit, but what we're seeing in many countries, so for example, some of our life histories from Uganda showed instances where parents had to withdraw their children from secondary school due to an inability to afford associated school fees. So these are some of the constraints that occur, especially in households with larger family sizes from our field work. Related, on another note, as a constraint to sustaining an escape, it wasn't necessarily one shock amongst households that pushed them back into poverty, but rather it was a combination or sequence of shocks which was associated with transitory rather than a sustained escape from poverty. And of course here, as a small aside, disability here is the one type of shock which emerged as on its own enough to push a household back into poverty, often due to the associated costs of foregone income opportunities, caretaking, and then the stigma and discrimination elements also associated with the issue. And relatedly, from the policy side, moving into the policy side of things, what we see is that in terms of shocks, there is a lot of headway being made in terms of responses in terms of environmental shocks, but still idiosyncratic shocks across countries. There's a relative absence of policies to address idiosyncratic shocks. And what I mean by these shocks include, for example, health shocks. So Rwanda is a prime example of a successful case with with the extent of universal health coverage, which has been seen in our life histories, wherein health shocks was rarely cited as an impoverisher amongst households. But then if you look at, for example, Ethiopia, ill health was time and again an event which had led over time to households moving back into poverty. Another such policy, an idiosyncratic shock, is also in terms of oftentimes the high costs associated with social events and cultural obligations in many countries. For example, some of our life histories from Ethiopia highlighted families which mothers contributing to wedding expenses, funeral expenses, other social community obligations, which often then, in many cases, then they didn't have money to feed their children. So that the primacy of these cultural obligations, even though there is some legal penalties and so on, really there is a space for more policies and implementation of policies and laws and so on to prevent, or some form of risk insurance mechanism for some of these social policies.
Yes, so I think that this is pure speculation, but and I think something that makes impact evaluations, I think in general, better in every way is if they're conducted by multidisciplinary teams, and I think by multidisciplinary teams, so you had different areas of expertise, and I think that maybe the first wave of impact evaluations, maybe that wasn't so much the case. I think another issue is that a lot of the studies that we identified in this area, it's based on existing data, so it's using existing forestry data sets, existing kind of national surveys. So then people, the researchers are kind of working with the data that they have. It's more expensive to, so if, for example, to do subgroup analysis, you would have to have a larger sample size. Yeah, I'll stop there. I think those are probably some reasons. Yeah.
My reading, when you say multidisciplinarity, and these were not the case before, is that I mean, from what I hear, I see an econometric bias in previous impact analysis, and from an economic standpoint, economic inequalities, as I said, are not necessarily seen as a problem.
And I think
and sometimes. And that's where it becomes really complicated. This in the previous session, a person from Mexico mentioned that the two most rich countries of Latin America are also the most unequal. If you look at the data over the past 25 years or so, you will see that the rise of the South, so to speak, the development of countries such as Brazil or India or China, is accompanied by raising inequalities. As a result, that is to say, it's because you have economic growth that you have winners and losers. So, from that standpoint, I mean, there is an argument, an economic argument, to say these inequalities are actually positive. And we are totally rejoined the previous speaker is in the current discourse is to say, well, yes, maybe they are in the short run. On the long run, they create tensions, they create a lack of social cohesion, they create security risks. Too strong inequalities are therefore dangerous from a security standpoint. So that's where, if you wish, the security discussion sort of trumps the economic discussion, hopefully. All right, I'm not sure whether that rambling is making sense to anyone. I'm going to take a question. So, Madam was the first one.
Thank you very much. I'm Delphine Borian, I'm the French permanent representative. So thank you very much for this discussions, very stimulating. I very much appreciated also Cecilia Poggi insight on the territorial inequalities. I think indeed when we speak about inequality, there are so many different dimensions as income, of course, but also territorial, as you said, but also gender related or generation. And inequalities that young and older people also is very important to tackle. Second point is related to a bit, I'll ask your question, Olivier, about for the people who get back to the poverty trap. And thank you for your reply, Vidya. I think that's a major issue for the sustainability of the benefits of our project. How do you feel that our project, IFAD project or other projects, take into account this risk of going backwards? And what can we do? And with regard to that, I'm very much interested by the impact of social safety nets programs. Because, of course, we know that you spoke about health problem. We very well know that when a family or household has a health problem, you can go down very, very quickly under the poverty line, and then it's very, very hard to recover. So why don't we have more of these social safety nets that we really, I feel it's very so useful for helping the whole population to get up?
We'll take 3 of them and then try and answer in a row. In the meantime, if you think that you can take any of those questions, please mark your interest.
Thank you very much for this interesting discussion. I have few contributions, especially the first point regarding sliding back into poverty and inequality. So 4 major points I see, especially for rural areas in Africa. First is access to social services. Like my colleague said, the issue of health. So if even you're making a lot of money from your farm and you have issues with your kid or your wife, so you have to spend all that money. So you don't have enough to reproduce your farm activities. The second one is the access to assets, land, house, facilities, and so on. Most of the income is redirected also to those one, which complement what you have said earlier. And one important point which was not mentioned is remittances. Most of these people now migrate into the cities or outside the country. So overall, the household is the issue of social protection, which is not necessarily budgeted and institutionalized, is being replaced by the remittances coming from maybe, I don't know, house help from that family or someone working in the city or as a migrant in the West. And then my second point is more on inequality could be positive. I totally disagree with you because, you know, this is when you want to build prosperous and strong equal societies, you need to tackle inequality. So there is no way you have an unequal society where some people are earning a lot, the others not, and you will be spending a lot of money from the government budget to ensure your own security, because the moment it happens and security is there, so that budget was supposed to go on development issues is going to protect a few minority of people, which I believe is not really sustainable on the long run. And we have seen a lot of issues in some countries. The last point is for Senegal. So I believe for your studies, being a citizen from Senegal, especially looking at inequalities, there is what they call la carte d'égalité des chances, where you have also disabled people, poor people. So they have a registro unique, one where you have all those people, and those communities are receiving la bourse familiale. It's more direct transfer. They're the one also receiving all these payment for ecosystem services or different type of projects. So there is a concentration of a lot of money going to that, including remittances. So I think for your studies to be also more oriented to those specific group, you should work directly with the delegation de la protection sociale, which is the one dealing on social protection of those different groups. Thanks.
Thank you very much. For the record, this was not my theory. I'm more like a centrist. I do believe, of course, that inequalities, if they are too strong, are dangerous for society, or not only a moral sort of scandal, but are also a danger for social cohesion. But the point, vice versa, is to say that if you get to a society where everybody is absolutely equal, first of all, it's probably not achievable. We are mammals, after all. We are animals. We are competitive. We are, you know, it's not achievable, but also it could be perhaps demotivating in the end. So, you know, in trying to address inequalities, I think we shouldn't be so gung-ho and optimistic that we think that we can erase them totally. That's all. I'm not saying they're necessarily always a good thing.
Yes, actually, I wanted to, first of all, add up a little bit to these two interventions that came, and also perhaps to reply to one that I see here on the screen, which comes from the media talking about social cohesion. So, first of all, with regarding to the question, if there is a slide back into a poverty trap, what can we do about it? And what is the role of social safety nets programs? Of course, these are extremely relevant, and the social safety nets may need to be in place, particularly to provide coverage according to, of course, the type of safety net that it is added to address a country-specific issue. However, there is something that, as like a policy or development practitioner, we always need to think, is that a core issue of management and targeting at times can be a very, very impeding factors. So we always have this big trade-off in the, particularly in the social protection field where I come from, on saying, is it better a universal approach or a more targeted one? And what can we do when we do identify a population but we don't have the means to develop a strong or like extended program? And this, of course, like my like say like off of the head response would be that it really depends on the local context of like how the involvement that is done within the national authorities, but also on the same exact agents which could receive such a programs. And here our colleague from Senegal who suggested on saying we do have some social protection measures such as a targeted registry with whom we give social protection to the population could be one part of the solution to extend such programs. But of course, I just want to emphasize as a bit of a critics that like I'm just adding a little bit of like a counter argument on saying that at times targeting programs can be very complex to manage, and so we may also have to think on how to convince in a political discourse the population to debate about the role of universal access to services and which up to which coverage can we lead. And this is a very, of course, broad topic. I'm sure that many people here in the audience would have a much better argument to take than me. But moving forward on the specificity of the very, very brief introduction to the Senegal project that I proposed to you, in reality the collaboration of my research colleagues is directly with the Ministry of Agriculture to just start off by creating some simulated scenario of analysis. So the novelty of this project is actually to go with the University of Thiès and the ISRA to perform some analysis of plot and land management, to then basically try to see what are the farm, to better understand what are different forms of farm behavior in the same locality, and within that to understand inequality. So I really thank you for the idea of saying think together on this aspect. And last, there was a question which was asked within the system about what is the link of social cohesion and inequality and poverty. And one of the ideas that at least comes to my mind when we talk about this topic is to try to be as clear as we can on what do we mean by social cohesion. And at the IFAD, actually, we started a process of analysis to create a working definition on how could we better measure and understand what do we mean. And actually, I have even jotted it down because it is so large and complex that the idea that we have a social cohesion as a working definition, not like, of course, internationally defined, is that there may be some, and then I will close, but the direct way into which inequality can affect social cohesion is by, first of all, breaking ties of within and between groups. And this is what I think the policy debates probably would need to then make better research about.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Cecilia. Vidya, you want to take the question about safety nets?
Yes, sure, and we can speak about this more after because I realize we're constrained by time. But for example, yes, completely what you're saying on social safety nets, the importance is paramount. And also, specifically, for example, back to the issue of health insurance, of the health issue. For in Rwanda, for example, you see a very limited ill health as a pauperizing effect, and this is partly due to the increasing availability of health insurance together with the proximity of health facilities and public works also, which cushion shocks for the poorest. Compare this to Tanzania where, so for example, in Rwanda, community-based health insurance in 2009 covered around 89% of the population, whereas compare this to Tanzania in rural areas where it covers just 18%. So then, in order, policy options then to prevent this re-impoverishment, to prevent transitory escapes could include introducing a health insurance scheme which subsidizes the poor, introducing social benefits as well in the form of disability benefits and so on. And finally, to respond to the issue on remittances, in Kenya, I mean, across countries, this is a strategy which is operating as a way to escape poverty. Of course, it needs to be, there are risks which need to be mitigated, of course. There's, it needs to be made safer, fairer, and so on. But in Kenya, what we see specifically is migration of men to urban centers for work, leaving behind their families, and the associated remittances was from the fieldwork the most prevalent strategy to escaping poverty sustainably. But a key component of this strategy for its success was that the female head then remains in the village with the children and is often then able to build on, for example, an improved house, purchase land as investments in old age to counter these life cycle effects, to counter some of the age-based inequalities that you also mentioned. Thank you.
Thank you, Vidya. That's very interesting. I'm finishing a project where we looked into a lot of migration situations and the resulting so-called feminization of agriculture, in the sense that, yes, if man leaves for the city to work as construction workers or whatever, well, the farmers that remain are female. And therefore, I think there's a role or an opportunity for us, people working in IFAD or WFP or FAO, to feminize also support system to agriculture. I thank you very much for your attention. I'm afraid we need to close the discussion today. There's another session coming up on
Session 8, Mitigating Risk for the Last Mile.
Mitigating risks to improve farmers' livelihoods. All right, that seems interesting. Thank you.